So now we are going to talk about monopoly. So in the monopoly industry, there will be only one supplier in the whole market. While in the perfect competitive market, there are unlimited small suppliers and they have no determination of the market price. But for the monopoly market, it has only one supplier. So this one supplier has the power to determine the market price. So to maximize the monopoly's profit, we set the marginal revenue equal to marginal cost to get the equilibrium price. So why do we use the marginal revenue equal to marginal cost? So now let's derive the expression here. So as we know, profit is equal to total revenue minus total cost. And total revenue is equal to P multiplied by Q. While the total cost is a function of Q. So to get the maximum profit, we set d pi over dq is equal to 0 and solve for the q that will maximize our profit. So dtr dq minus dtc dq is equal to 0. And we know that dtr over dq is equal to marginal revenue. So if we sell one more unit, so how many additional total revenue can we collect? And dTC dQ is equal to the marginal cost. So if we produce one more unit, what will be the additional cost to produce that additional unit? So when marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, the first derivative of d pi over dq will be 0. So that corresponding q will be the point that our profit will be maximized. So now let's look at the marginal revenue for both the perfect competitive market and the monopoly market. So for the perfect competitive market, those small firms do not have any power to determine the price. So the marginal revenue is equal to price. And this price is determined by demand curve. But for the monopoly market, price on the demand curve will be greater than the marginal revenue, and you are going to see it from our graph that we are going to talk about. So now let's look at the graph for the monopoly market. So we have the downward sloping demand curve and we have the upward sloping supply curve, or we can call it marginal cost curve, since you know that marginal cost curve is a supply curve. So if this is a perfect competitive market, when supply is equal to demand, so D is equal to MC, the intersection point A will be the equilibrium point for the perfect competitive market at the price of P0 and the quantity of the Q0. But now if we are the monopoly market, we set marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. So for the marginal revenue, the slope of the marginal revenue will be twice as large as the demand curve. So let's see why the slope is twice as large as the demand curve. So we know the total revenue is equal to P multiplied by Q. And marginal revenue is equal to dTR over dQ. So marginal revenue is equal to dTR over dQ. So now let's assume that P is equal to 10 minus Q, and this is our demand curve. So we know that TR is equal to P multiplied by Q. And P is a function of Q. So P is equal to 10 minus Q. And our total revenue is equal to 10 minus Q multiplied by Q. So marginal revenue is equal to dTR over dQ. So it's equal to 10 minus 2Q. So our demand curve P is equal to 10 minus Q. And our marginal revenue is equal to 10 minus 2Q. So you can see that the only difference between the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve is that the slope of the marginal revenue curve is twice as large as the slope of the demand curve. So that's why we have the pink line with the marginal revenue and with a larger slope. And to get the equilibrium point, we set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. So this is our marginal cost curve, and the pink one is our marginal revenue curve. So the intersection point B will correspond to the equilibrium point Q1 for the monopoly market. So we solve for Q1, and this is the equilibrium quantity in monopoly market. But if we want to calculate the equilibrium price, we don't use MC curve, we use the demand curve. So if we substitute Q1 to demand curve, and we calculate the corresponding price for point C, P1. So P1 is the short run equilibrium price. So you can see that in a perfect competitive market, the equilibrium point is point A, and the price is P0 and the Q is Q0. But if it is a monopoly market, our equilibrium point is point C, which the price that will be paid by the customer will be P1, and the Q that will be consumed will be Q1. So now it comes to the other point of the efficiency loss. So efficiency loss is a loss of gain to society due to monopoly. So now let's look at which part should be the efficiency loss in the monopoly market. So let's look at a graph. So for the perfect competitive market, we are at point A. So the top triangle will be the consumer surplus. So the top triangle is the consumer surplus. And the bottom triangle will be our producer surplus. So the total gain to society is equal to the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus, which is the whole part of the big triangle. Then let's look at what is the total gain to society for the monopoly market. So for the monopoly market, the price paid by the consumers will be P1. So the top pink will be the consumer surplus for the monopoly market. And we also have the producer surplus part. So producer surplus, they charge P1, and Q is equal to Q1. So the whole bottom part in pink will be the producer surplus to the monopoly market. So our total gain to society will be the top triangle plus the bottom part. So at the beginning, our total gain to society will be the whole big triangle. But when we move to monopoly market, nobody gets a small part. So the little triangle here with all the pink dots. So this one, nobody got it. So the triangle with all the pink dots will be our efficiency loss due to monopoly. So the last knowledge point that we want to talk about for the monopoly market will be the tax effect. So if the government levy a tax of T on the supplier, so what will be the tax effect? So as we know that to calculate the original equilibrium point, we set the marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. So for simplicity of the graph, we assume that we have the horizontal supply curve. So we have horizontal marginal cost. So our beginning equilibrium point will be P0 star and Q0 star. So originally we are at point A. So now we have the tax of T. So MC is our before tax supply curve. So when we levy the amount of tax on the supplier, we shift our supply curve up to MC after tax. So we shift it up by the T amount. So again, after tax, we still need to find the intersection of the marginal revenue and the marginal cost. But now the marginal cost we use is the after-tax marginal cost curve. So this new horizontal line is our new marginal cost curve after tax, and the downward sloping marginal revenue. So the intersection corresponding to Q1 star will be our new equilibrium quantity after tax. So if we substitute, so we know Q1 star depends on marginal revenue equal to marginal cost after tax. So if we substitute Q1 star to demand curve, so if we substitute Q1 star to demand curve to point B at P1 star, so the P1 star will be the consumer price. So the consumers has to pay P1 star after tax. Since we know the relationship between the consumer price, CP, and the producer price, PP, we know the consumer price minus the producer's price is equal to the tax amount. So our PP, that is how much the producers can keep, is equal to the consumer's price minus the tax, which is the P1 star minus the tax. So now let's try to find the effect of the tax on the graph. So as we just talked about, that efficiency loss due to the monopoly will be the small triangle on the right. So let's recall how this one is calculated. So we know at the beginning the whole big triangle will be the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus if we are in the perfect competitive market. But if we are in the monopoly market, we are going to produce Q0 at the price of P0 star. So the whole part on the left will be the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. So the green triangle that nobody got, which is the part 1, we want to specify this triangle is our efficiency loss due to the monopoly. So now let's try to find what is the excess burden due to the tax. So we assume P2 is equal to the producer surplus. And we already calculated that P1 star is the consumer surplus. So P2 star is equal to P1 star minus the tax. So now let's find the new consumer surplus and the producer surplus. So the suppliers are going to charge P1 star to the consumer. So the consumers pay P1 star. And the top triangle, which is number 2, is the consumer surplus new after tax. Then let's look at what is the new producer surplus after the tax. So the producer's price is what the producers can keep. So they only keep P2. So the area between the P2, the supply curve, which is a horizontal line here, and at the units of Q1. So part 3 is a new producer surplus after tax. And the distance between the P1 and P2 is a tax amount. And if the government levied a tax, there is a portion of the total gain to society that will go to the government as a tax revenue. So for the middle rectangle, we know here is a distance between the P1 star and P2 star. So this is the tax. And the base will be Q1 star, which is the amount that will be treated after tax. So the tax revenue is equal to the tax per unit multiplied by the Q1 star, which is the number of units that will be transacted in the market. So the middle rectangle, which is part 3, which is a part 4, will be the tax revenue, and it's the rectangle. So now we can see that the total gain to society after tax will be the part 2 consumer surplus plus the part 3 producer surplus plus the tax revenue, part 4. So 2 plus 3 plus 4 will be the new total gain to society. So what happened to the middle part? We know the right part of this big triangle is the efficiency loss due to the monopoly, and the whole left part is the total gain to society. So the middle part in green, so the whole part in green will be the excess burden of the tax. Now we have two parts of the efficiency loss. Part 1 is the efficiency loss due to the monopoly, and we specified this one to be part 5. So part 5 is the excess burden or debt we lost due to the tax. So 4 plus 5 is the total loss to society. So let's go over the 3 types of questions that can be asked in the monopoly topic. So the first one will be calculate the equilibrium price and quantity for the monopoly firm. So as we just go over from the graph, first we need to derive the marginal revenue and the marginal cost. So the marginal revenue comes from DTR over DQ. And the marginal cost comes from DTC over DQ. And second step is we set the marginal revenue equal to marginal cost to solve for the equilibrium quantity, Q star. Then we substitute the Q star to the demand curve. So make sure you substitute the number to the correct curve. It's not marginal revenue, marginal cost curve. We substitute Q star to the demand curve to solve for the P star, which is paid by the consumer. So after these three steps, we can get the value of P star and Q star. So the second type of question will be the tax levied on the monopoly market. First, we need original P0 star and Q0 star. We have to know what is the original point. So to calculate the two values, you can follow the exactly same steps from our part A. So for the part 1 type of question. And the second step will be we shift the marginal cost curve by the tax amount. So remember, no matter the tax is on the supplier side or is on the consumer side, we always shift the marginal cost curve because it's always easier for us to calculate the numbers. If you want to shift the demand curve, you have to shift both the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve. So it's very easy to make mistakes by shifting the demand side. So that's why we always shift the supply side, because the final result of shifting the supply curve or demand curve will be exactly the same. And the third step will be calculate the new P1 star and Q1 star. And we already go over the step to find the P1 star and Q1 star point from the graph we just go over. And the last step will be, after we draw the areas and calculated all the points, P0 star, Q0 star, P1 star, and Q1 star, we already know the consumer price and supplier's price in different situations. Then we find the areas from the graph of the new consumer surplus, producer surplus, tax revenue, and excess burden. And the excess burden comes from two parts. One is the tax, so we have the excess burden from the tax. And we also have the efficiency loss from the monopoly. And we already found the both areas from the graph that we talk about in our knowledge summary. And the third type of question that will be covered is the government restriction. Because we can see that in the monopoly market, price is greater than the marginal revenue. So the monopoly market will always have a profit. So to restrict their profit, the government may have the restriction of how much they can charge. So for example, the government may require the monopoly firm to charge at the profit is equal to 0. So when the profit is equal to 0, the total revenue is equal to total cost. So by using this formula, you can calculate the new Q that should be traded. Or it may ask you to calculate if the government restriction is to charge at the average cost or charge at the minimum average variable cost. So it depends on the type of questions of the government restriction. So after we calculate the Q, we substitute the Q to the demand curve. And after we got all the values, we can calculate the new consumer surplus and new profit to the monopoly firm. Or you can draw the graph and find the area, which area specify the consumer surplus and which area specify the new profit or producer surplus after the government restriction.